Good afternoon and welcome to this year's Personal Data Breach Seminar. My name's Laura Middleton and I'm the Group Manager for the ICO's Personal Data Breach Service. And I'm joined today by Victoria Bradshaw, who's one of the team managers in the PDB service, and by Caroline Brown and Katie Galgut, who are lead case officers in the team. So you may have spoken to them if you've contacted us for advice or reported a breach. So this year, we thought we'd give you a bit of a behind-the-scenes look at the work of the PDB service, including what happens after you submit a breach report, some insight into what helps us assess your breach, and we'll share the reason that most organisations get in touch. We're also going to look at some case studies, and we'll be asking you to participate as we go along, so get those buzzers at the ready. But first, I'm going to hand over to Vicky.
Thanks, Laura. So we're going to start by looking at what happens after you submit a personal data breach report to the ICO. All breach reports made under the UK GDPR or the DPA are reviewed by the PDB service. We reviewed around 10,000 breach reports last year and the same the year before. After a breach report has been received, we start by setting up each case on our case management system where it's assigned a reference number. We then review the report to see if it needs to be treated as a priority. This could be an ongoing data incident where the personal data has not yet been contained, a breach that affects lots of people, or a cyber incident that we think needs the input of our specialist cyber investigations colleagues. If we think it's a priority case, we'll alert the relevant internal teams. The case may be picked up by our investigation colleagues at this point, and they'll take responsibility for contacting you. Everything else remains with the PDB service, over 3/4 of the reports received. We then look at whether we have enough information to decide what to do next. In most cases, we have enough information, so we provide advice and close the case. If we don't have enough information, we'll contact you to find out more about the breach and review the information you provide. We then go through that decision-making process again. If it's appropriate to provide advice and close the case, we'll do so. If not, we'll refer the case to investigations. What else do we do with the information about breaches? We look for patterns and trends arising from the breach reported to us. So you may receive extra information about other breaches you're at risk of experiencing when we write to you. If we notice a pattern or trend within your organisation, we may invite you to a meeting to talk about what's happened. We also work with colleagues across the ICO, so if we think you'd benefit from an advisory check for small organisations or an audit for larger organisations, we'll discuss that with the relevant teams before contacting you. So how quickly will you hear from us? You should receive an automated email bounce back when you send a breach report to the mailbox, so you'll know your email has reached us safely. As a minimum, you should receive an acknowledgement within 7 days of submitting your report, which includes your case reference number. This is in case you need to supply further information. If we're able to resolve your case in 7 days, you may not receive an acknowledgement, just our final response. In around 60% of cases, you'll receive a decision within 30 days of reporting, and it's rare for us to have a case open more than 3 months after it's been reported. But if the ICO begins an investigation, complex cases can take up to a year to complete. We don't just deal with clear-cut reportable breaches, we also provide advice to organisations who've experienced a breach and are still in the process of dealing with it. One of the most common reasons organisations contact us is to ask us whether the breach they've experienced is reportable. Caroline's now going to take you through a couple of case studies and get your view on whether you would like to or whether you would report them.
Thank you, Vicky. As you might already be aware, not all personal data breaches are reportable to the ICO. If your organisation does have a breach occur, one of the first steps you should take is to complete a full risk assessment regarding the potential risk to the affected data subjects, which will help you decide if it meets the threshold to report to us. Each breach should be taken on a case-by-case basis and all aspects of the incident considered. I'm now going to take you through 2 breaches, and we want you to consider all the information provided and vote on whether you think they are reportable or not. So there'll be 3 different options. There'll be yes, no, or maybe. So first case study. So a solicitor is on their way home from work and has left their laptop bag on the London Underground, and they only realise this once they get home. The laptop contains sensitive information on client cases, which includes criminal conviction data and health data. whether the laptop was password protected and also encrypted. The solicitor also believes the bag may have contained some loose paper notes that they made in a meeting. Staff would typically dispose of any confidential paper documents when in the office. They think it's unlikely that any information was left in the laptop bag, and if there are paper notes, it's very unlikely the information would identify any individuals due to how they record their notes. The data on the laptop was backed up, so they still have access to the information. They've also reset their passwords on their accounts as a precaution, and the incident has been reported to the Transport for London, so they'll be told if their laptop is found. So I'd now like you to consider all the information I've just given you and vote on whether you think it's a reportable incident to the ICO. So as I said, there'll be the 3 different options, yes, no, or maybe, and I'll just give you a moment or two to consider that and vote. Okay, so hopefully that's all given you enough time to vote on that first case study. So I'll now move on to the second one. So a member of staff at a school is sending out a spreadsheet to parents about free school meals. It's the end of the day and they're rushing to complete their last remaining tasks and in error send out a partially completed spreadsheet. The spreadsheet contains the details of 10 children and their parents. There are 18 parents who are yet to complete the spreadsheet, and they are the recipients of the email containing the partially completed spreadsheet. The spreadsheet asks them to complete the children's names, addresses, allergies, confirmation of free school meal entitlement, the parent's name, and their bank account details. The member of staff realises their mistake the next morning, and the parents have been emailed to ask them to delete the spreadsheet and to confirm in writing that this has been done. However, they're yet to receive confirmation from 8 of the parents that this has been done, and it's coming up to the 72 hours since the school became aware of the breach. The school also have concerns there could be a risk of fraud as bank details have been included and the breach yet hasn't been fully contained. They've received a complaint from a parent who's highlighted the breach to them, and they have concerns that their data has been disclosed and may now be shared with their ex-partner by one of the recipients of the email. So again, if you could consider all that information that I've just given you and vote on whether you think it's reportable. So again, yes, no, or maybe, and I'll just give you a moment to consider that. So we'll reveal the results to the 2 polls later on, but first Kate is going to take you through how to conduct a risk assessment after a personal data breach has occurred.
Thanks, Caroline. So we know from the calls that we take on our data breach helplines that assessing the risk to individuals and therefore deciding whether an incident needs to be reported to the ICO is consistently the main area in which organisations need our advice. I'm going to take you through what we mean by risk, what factors you should consider when assessing an incident, and how these fit into your risk assessment. So the focus on risk when we're looking at reporting a breach will be regarding the negative consequences for the individuals affected. There will always be other risks for you to consider, such as the risk to your reputation or financial loss, but your first response from the ICO's point of view should be to look at the risk to individuals and think about any steps you can take to reduce that risk or help them in some other way. A breach can have a range of adverse effects on individuals, and there'll be a risk where the breach may lead to physical, material, or non-material damage for the affected people. Some examples of possible consequences are emotional distress, discrimination, identity theft or fraud, financial loss, damage to reputation, or any other significant emotional or social disadvantage to the person concerned. Some breaches will cause little risk beyond inconvenience to someone trying to do their job, while others can have significant consequences. Risk needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, looking at all the relevant factors. So, what factors should we consider? First of all, confirm whether the breach affects personal data. If not, you won't need to assess the risk to individuals. An example of this would be where an incident has only affected business information, such as financial projections or supplier contracts, or property information, like building repair invoices. If the breach does involve personal data, you'll need to consider the following factors. What type of breach is it? So a personal data breach is something that affects the confidentiality, availability, or integrity of the information you hold. An incident where information has been disclosed to an unauthorised individual will cause a different set of consequences than an incident which has resulted in information no longer being available. A key factor in your risk assessment will be the type of personal data that's been compromised, how sensitive this may be, and the volume of data involved. Typically, the more sensitive the information, the higher the risk of harm will be. Breaches that involve identity documents, financial or health data can all cause harm on their own, but together this volume of data could be used for identity theft. When considering what data has been disclosed, also consider whether the role of your organisation also reveals something about an individual. For example, you could infer more information from the mailing list of a charity that supports individuals with a specific medical condition than you could from the list of an estate agent's. Who is affected? A breach could involve the personal data of children or vulnerable people, which may place them at a greater risk of harm. There may also be other factors about the individuals involved which may affect how a breach may impact them. Look at how many people are affected. Generally, the higher the number of individuals affected, the higher the potential impact of a breach. This is not to say that a breach needs to affect large numbers of individuals to cause a risk, however, as a breach affecting a single person could have significant consequences. Also, look at how easily someone with access to the data compromised could identify who it related to. Now, this could be possible directly from the information disclosed, or it could be difficult to match the data to a specific person. Data that's been appropriately encrypted, for example, would be unintelligible for persons without that decryption key. Consider who has access to the data compromised. It could be an unknown party, an individual that uses your service, or another organisation that you have an ongoing relationship with. If there's been a disclosure, did the recipient proactively contact you and advise of the breach? Consider whether you feel the recipient would use the information in an unauthorised or malicious way, or whether you can trust them to delete the information as requested. Is the incident contained? So consider whether the data is back under the control of your organisation. Has the unintended recipient confirmed they've securely destroyed or deleted the information? Have you located data that you thought was lost? Have you remotely wiped the laptop that was stolen or changed your system passwords? Finally, consider if there are any further actions you can take aside from containment to mitigate the severity of the possible consequences. So, how do we use this information to assess risk? Well, if you've considered all these factors already, your risk assessment is mostly done. You should work through each factor we've discussed, considering the whole context of an incident. Think about how seriously you think people might be harmed by what's happened, but also think about the likelihood of those harms occurring. The more severe you think those possible consequences are, then the higher the risk will be. Similarly, the more likely you think the consequences are to happen, the higher the risk will be. Looking at the incident as a whole and working through the factors we discussed will help you assess the risk. So Caroline is now going to take us through those case studies again and provide our opinion on whether they meet the threshold to report.
Yeah, as Katie said, we're now going to review the case studies we saw earlier and see how you voted. And I'll give you a reminder of each case study involved as well. So first case study is a solicitor who's left their password protected and encrypted laptop on the London Underground. So the poll results are yes, it should be reported to us was 14%, no 82%, and 4% was maybe. So overall, a large majority believes it's not a reportable breach. And we would agree. So although the laptop has not been found and the device contains special category data, Appropriate security measures were in place, and it's unlikely the information will be accessed as the device is password protected and encrypted, limiting the risk there'll be a breach of confidentiality. The passwords for the accounts have also been reset, and the solicitor still has access to all the data, so the availability of the information has not been affected. The change of passwords have also helped contain the incident. They consider it very unlikely that there would be paper notes included, and if there are, the individuals would not be identifiable. As such, it's unlikely there will be negative consequences for the data subjects, as there's a low risk of the data being accessed and the information is still available. So we'll now review the second case study that we looked at. So this was a partially completed spreadsheet containing children's names, addresses, allergies, parents' names and bank account details, which was sent to 18 parents in error. So the results for this one was yes, 95% believe it should be reported to the ICO, 3% voted no, it shouldn't be, and 3% were not sure. And we would agree with the majority of you, it is a reportable breach to the ICO. The confidentiality of the information has been affected as it's been sent to individuals who should not have access to it. The data disclosed relates to children, and the incident is yet to be fully contained, as not all the recipients have confirmed the data has been securely deleted. The school have also considered what the potential consequences can be and are concerned there could be a risk of fraud because of the categories of personal data contained in the spreadsheet, which includes bank details. An individual affected by the incident has also raised concerns that their contact details could be shared with the next partner. As the school can't say, it's unlikely there won't be negative consequences to the data subjects because of the type of data disclosed, and the incident has not yet been contained. It should be reported to us. So I'll now pass over to Laura, who will talk you through how to report a breach to the ICO.
Thank you. So, excuse me, we're going to have a look at how you can report your breach if that's what you decide to do after carrying out your risk assessment. So broadly, you can report your breach in two ways. You can visit our website and download our breach report form, or you can phone us. So the legislation sets out some key pieces of information you need to provide when reporting your breach, but to fully understand what's happened, we often need to know more than that. So a great way for you to be certain that we've sort of understood what you've told us and to avoid follow-up questions is to report by phone. You'll speak to a member of the team who'll be assigned your case from that first call to the point it's either closed by the PDB service or referred to another team. If you're struggling with your risk assessment and want to talk it through with somebody, you can stay on the line if you decide to report your breach. We may even be able to give you the outcome there and then. We know that a lot of organisations are sometimes fearful of calling us because you hear a lot about fines for data breaches in the news. But a few things to remember there, I think, are that we issue very few fines based on the number of reports that we receive. We reserve that fining power for the most serious breaches that we see. And if you've experienced a reportable breach, we'd much rather hear it from you than we would from somebody else, though I accept it might take you about 72 hours to work out kind of what's gone on, whether you need to report and to pull that report together. I think that most people who've called us to discuss a breach agree that we're very friendly and helpful and help put them at ease. What it also does is it takes the pressure off you having to have all the answers. So if you want to contact the ICO, they can give you some steps to take either to contain your breach or to help mitigate the effects on individuals. And I think people who've used that service have kind of come off the phone and thought, oh great, I'm not just in this panic. There are things that I can do now, kind of practical steps to work through to deal with the breach. So please drop us a comment in the chat box if you've had that experience, and we'll have a look at those later. So just for completeness, I should also mention that if you're an NHS organisation in England, you'll use the NHS reporting tool to report your breach, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So despite everything I've said about the benefits of reporting by phone, if you'd rather not speak to us and you choose to use that online tool, online reporting form, then that's absolutely fine. That's your choice, and lots of organisations choose to report in that way. What we'd ask is that you answer all relevant questions and provide us with as much detail as possible. And we might still want to phone you to clarify some of the information provided. There are a few areas of the form that organisations commonly struggle with, and so I thought it might be helpful today to talk you through what we're looking for in these particular sections. So one of the questions we ask is the personal data breach likely to result in a high risk to data subjects? Often organisations say that they don't know. Excuse me. But as we've just heard from Katie, you can't really make a decision to report without answering that question. It's also going to inform your next steps. If there's a high risk to data subjects, you need to tell them too. There's a section where you can include more detail, so show us you're working. Similarly, when we ask you to describe any detriment to individuals that has arisen or could arise in the future, please explain your thinking. It really helps us understand how you've arrived at that decision around the likelihood of the risks that you've identified arising and the possible impact if that risk does materialise. Categories of personal data included in the breach is another one that people can struggle with. We've recently added a subsection into the form to allow you to provide more details, and this is to help us understand the nature of the personal data included in the breach. So previously we had just a list that you could choose from, but what we found is that health data, for instance, could be quite wide-ranging and isn't always very sensitive. Financial data, like credit card numbers, might be sensitive, but will be less so if only partial numbers are involved. So without that additional context, it's likely that we'd need to follow up because we're going to assume the worst case scenario. What preventative measures did you have in place? Sometimes organisations tell us about the containment measures that they had in place, like after a breach has happened, rather than what was in place beforehand. There's a separate section about post-breach activity. What we're looking for with preventative measures is everything you had in place that should have stopped the breach from happening. So policies and procedures, physical and technical measures, such as encrypting laptops, like in that first case study, and also training. We do ask quite a few questions about training. So whether the person involved in the breach had received data protection training and what that training involves. And that's because training is one of the main ways that you can help prevent breaches. If your staff receive good, regular training on data protection, and crucially, they know how it applies to their role, we'll be more confident that you've got things covered. So if that information is missing from your report entirely, or the person involved in the breach hasn't been trained recently, or if we think the content is too basic for the data that you're dealing with, it's likely that we'll need to discuss that with you further. So looking at as many breach reports as we do, and I've been dealing with them for 10 years now, so I'd hate to guess how many cases that amounts to, there'll always be a few things that we see that we would prefer organisations to avoid. So sometimes it seems that organisations choose to report because they think the people affected by the breach might complain to the ICO, and they're sort of trying to get ahead of that complaint. So the impact on individuals is something that you need to take into account when you make your risk assessment, but reporting to the ICO doesn't kind of cut off that complainant's right to come to us if they remain dissatisfied having gone through your complaints process. And we will review our breach decisions if we receive complaints from individuals about those breaches, because we want to take into account their side of the story. When you're making your risk assessment in that first 72 hours, you can only estimate how they're going to be affected by an incident, but they will know what the impact of it has been on them. I mentioned the NHS reporting tool for organisations in England earlier. An extraordinary amount of work went into creating that tool, designed to record information about breaches that the NHS kind of want to see, and then making a decision as to which of those incidents needs to be reported to the ICO. But what we've seen is organisations manipulating the scoring in the tool, to be fair, most of the time to make sure the incidents come through to us rather than to try and hide them from us. The problem there is often they sound quite serious, and so we follow up with the organisation, but when we talk to you about it, it becomes clear that the situation you're describing doesn't match the report that we've got in front of us. So my advice there would be to trust that tool. You can always call us if you want that extra reassurance or to get our advice on the situation. That draws the presentation part of the seminar to a close. We'd now like to answer some of your questions, and we will answer as many as we can in the time that we have left. And Vicky is going to take the first batch for us.
Thanks, Laura. So the first question that we've had are the data subjects notified of a reported breach? Every organisation should provide a bounce back acknowledgement. So we don't notify data subjects when an organisation reports to us. We would expect you to notify them if there's a high risk to them. There are circumstances where they may find out if you confirm a breach has been reported, for example, in response to a media inquiry, or potentially under information that we publish proactively under our FOI obligations. Hopefully that's answered that question for you. So we've had another one. So if a recipient of personal data confirms this has been confidentially disposed of or double deleted, can we accept their word on this? Is that sufficient to mitigate the risk? So if you've taken steps to contain the incident, i.e. you've asked the recipient of the personal data to delete that and they've said so, then if you're happy that they've done that, then yes, we would suggest that that would be a mitigating factor. However, it's probably beneficial to ask them to document that in writing for you and note that on your breach log so that you have an audit trail of any actions that you've taken in response to that. So I'm going to pass over to Katie for the next couple of questions.
Yep. So we've had a question on what are the most common scenarios that arise which organisations report, but you don't believe should have been reported. I think this is quite a popular question. So we get quite a few errors where individuals haven't been BCC'd into an email where they should have been. In most cases, it's something like a sales email, something like that, and the only real personal data disclosed is email addresses, which we see as quite a basic piece of personal information. There's not a whole lot that you can do with that. However, like I said, kind of in my risk assessment section, do make sure that your organisation and what you do isn't disclosing further information about the people who received those emails. So in my example, if you're a charity that supports people with a specific illness, it can possibly be inferred that the recipients of that email might be suffering from that. And obviously that health information is a lot more sensitive than just kind of an email address. Also, email sent to incorrect recipients, that's something that we get quite a lot. If we're looking at a situation where it's quite limited in the personal data that's been disclosed, possibly the recipient's notified you of the incident, confirmed they've deleted it, and therefore the consequences and the likelihood of harm seem quite low. That's something that isn't necessarily going to need to be reported to us either. We've also had another question which kind of links into that one. So would you consider data sent to an incorrect recipient where there's been no disclosure a personal data breach? So the examples given were post sent to an incorrect address but returned unopened, or email sent with password protection. In the case of the post, there's going to be technically a small disclosure data there in terms of name and address. Again, quite basic information. It's not necessarily something that we would expect to see reported because those, the consequences if it's not been opened is going to be low for kind of misuse of that information in most circumstances. Email sent with password protection. If there's no kind of personal data disclosed, if they can't get into that, again, it's not going to be something that we would expect to see reported because, you've taken those measures like initially to kind of keep that data secure in transit, and the person on the other end isn't going to be able to get into it. So again, consequences and likelihood are probably quite unlikely there. Vicky, have you got further questions or any comments? Oh, I think you might be muted.
Apologies. I think we've just got another question in terms of the content of the risk assessment slides. So the question is the content of the risk assessment slides available on the ICO website? So do you want to answer that, given that was your section?
Yeah, absolutely. So what was on the kind of risk assessment slides is basically a succinct version of the information that's available on the website. So, you can go there on the personal data breach pages for kind of further information and basically in a bit more detail. You can also find, we have a self-assessment tool, which kind of takes you through the steps of a risk assessment to determine whether a breach is reportable. So that's kind of another useful tool that you could use as well in your risk assessments.
I think the next set of questions are going to be answered by Laura and Caroline.
So I'm going to take the first question. So we've had one which asks, in my sector, the severity of the data breach is outweighed by the reputational damage. Breaches are being reported which don't usually meet the threshold. Are we wasting your time? So we wouldn't say you're wasting our time reporting these breaches to us, but you also want to consider, why are you reporting it to us? What are you getting out of it? If you're looking to get some advice on how to handle the breach, how to prevent a recurrence, we do have our advice line which you can call, and we're always happy to talk through any breaches that you have with us. We would also advise that you should have confidence in your decision. So if you have carried out that full risk assessment and you feel it doesn't meet that threshold to report, you should have confidence in that and just document it internally. So you should be keeping that data breach log as well. So you would still have that record of the breach if you decide that it's not reportable to us. And we've had a second question as well about our first case study. This asked presumably whether or not the solicitor's IT supplier can remotely wipe the laptop is also a factor. And yes, this is, of course, something to take into consideration. So when undertaking your risk assessment, you should consider all aspects. So what security measures you have in place, whether it's likely that anyone would be able to access that data. And if the information can be wiped remotely, that's obviously something to take into account. And that will help contain the breach which has occurred as well. So I believe Laura has the next few questions to answer.
I do. So first, I'd just like to go with a bit of a plug, if I may. A member of the audience has said that when they had a data breach, they spoke anonymously to the ICO at first and couldn't find us more helpful. It says, when I went back to our senior team with the knowledge the ICO staff gave us, that they found us kind of very helpful. There was lots of guidance and no finger pointing. So I've not even had to make that up. That's a genuine comment from a member of the audience. But it's nice to see that that's the service that we want to provide. It's nice to see that that's how that experience is kind of being received. So we've got a question about the data security incident reporting tool. I called it the NHS toolkit. That's like the tool that automatically reports to the ICO. That says that it seems to be very public sector focused. And the questioner sort of wonders whether tools like that are skewing the results, and maybe whether the 3.5 million small and micro businesses simply do not report things to the ICO. So it's fair to say that we definitely get a greater proportion of reports from the public sector. I think we also need to remember that that tool is used by thousands of organisations. You think about every single GP surgery across the country, plus your larger health organisations, local government organisations. But perhaps there is underreporting from SMEs. Part of what the ICO is trying to do is to raise awareness of reporting organisations with our guidance and with events like this. It's also possible, because we heard the theory from Katie about how to conduct a risk assessment and sort of how you should come down in very kind of defined lines about how you report. But it's also possible that public sector organisations have a lower risk appetite and choose to report incidents that strictly don't meet the threshold. So that's that one. And let's have a look. We've got a question that says, the first question of our self-assessment tool, and there'll be a link to that later in the presentation, asks whether the incident affects the confidentiality, integrity and availability of personal data. And they've asked, how does this link to other harms, for example, transparency, and should those incidents be reported to the ICO? So when we talk about personal data breaches, we're talking about that very strict definition within the legislation of a breach being a breach of data security. So if there are other harms involved, then they strictly don't need to be reported to us. But I would say, if you're worried, contact us for advice and we can guide you. I think I've got another one. Just a kind of technical query there, because we've got different regimes in play. Somebody asking, should communication service providers be required to report breaches to the ICO within 24 hours rather than 72 hours? And yes, there is a separate breach reporting requirement under the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations, otherwise known as PECA. And so if you've got the breach that applies to, you need to follow the timescale set out in that legislation instead. If it isn't the kind of breach that PECA applies to, then you're back under UK GDPR, and it's the 72-hour requirement that applies. So I'm going to hand back over to Vicky and Katie for the next batch.
Thanks, Laura. So we've had a couple of questions regarding the form. So the first one is, can you submit your own data breach reporting form instead of using the ICO template? Yes, you can. And yes, you can just email into us. The reason that we have the data breach reporting form is because it has kind of the questions on there that we would ask of you. So it's always a useful tool. If you do send in your own breach reporting form, or you just email us, it would be useful for you to include that information. Otherwise, as we kind of covered in the previous slides, it might be that we need to write out to you, and that breach reporting process just becomes a bit longer. So the second one is, if a breach is reported by telephone, will we get anything in writing from the ICO to confirm that the breach does not need to be reported? We report via the form as it gives us an audit trail. So I can completely understand that you report by the form because you can save your local copy of that. If you call in, you do have a copy. So we will transcribe what you say on the phone to us. It won't be verbatim, but following that call, we'll send you a test email to ensure we have your correct email address. And then we will send you out a copy of what's been noted during the course of the call. If for any reason that copy needs amending, we can also do that. You just need to respond to us to let us know. In terms of that the breach does not need to be reported, we will always send out a closure letter for our cases if we decide that we're not taking it any further, or if we decide that it actually doesn't fall under the definition of a personal data breach. Katie, have you got anything to add to that, or do you want to jump into your next questions?
Yeah, I'll jump into the next question. So we have one that says, I often deal with breaches caused by missent emails where the severity and impact is low. At times, we advise a business to inform the individual in the interest of openness and transparency, despite that threshold not being met. Would we advise against this? I mean, there are things to consider. If potentially, you're dealing with, vulnerable adults or people that might be caused kind of stress by knowing that the incident has happened, you might want to consider, whether it's appropriate to inform them in that instance if you don't feel that high risk threshold has been met. But otherwise, no, we'd encourage you to be, as transparent as you can. You wouldn't have that obligation there to inform them if you didn't feel it was a high risk. But on the other hand, there is nothing there to kind of stop you informing individuals if you feel as though that's appropriate in the situation. I think, Laura, pass back to you. Got a couple more questions.
Yeah, I think we've got time for maybe one or two more. This part of the day always goes very quickly. So one that's getting quite a lot of interest is somebody who said, my NHS sector colleagues and I have noticed in the last few years that complainants seem to be getting savvy about how they complain, and the words they use, such as emotional trauma, anxious, not being able to work. And the person making the comment is saying that they don't want to come across as cynical, but on occasions they've seen comments being aimed at how to make a financial claim, and they're wondering how much weight that they should put on those comments. I think that's a decision that that you need to make as your organisation. As to whether you think that is genuine or not, and that's in the comment that some of those claims seem genuine and some of them don't. I think it's fair to be objective when you're assessing that. So if somebody says that they've had a huge impact from what appears to be a minor data breach, I think it's appropriate that you would kind of delve into that and see whether or not that's genuine. I talked about not just focusing on containment measures, but also looking at what you had in place to prevent an incident, because that is also what we will consider. So we'll take into account what individuals say about how they've been affected by an incident, but also, the requirement isn't that you do everything that can possibly be done in the universe to prevent a data breach. It's also that you take kind of reasonable steps that are appropriate to the data, appropriate to the, the budgets that you have in place and whatever. So it's, it's not absolute. So we would look at an incident in the round as well when we were considering it. So I'm thinking, I said I could take a couple more, but I think that we have to make that our last one because I want to make sure that you've got time to get to your next session. And so just going to move on to our final slide. So we've got a number of tools available to help you deal with personal data breaches, particularly to help you carry out your risk assessment and decide whether you need to report. So we've got a self-assessment tool, mentioned that in the questions there, and that walks you through the things that you need to consider and helps you decide whether or not you need to report. We've also got some data breach examples. So we've got 5 different breach scenarios and the ICO advice in relation to those, similar to the case studies that we looked at today. For SMEs, we've got guides on our SME web hub for how to respond to a breach and how to assess risk. And as always, if you're still unsure, you can always give us a call and talk through the incident with one of our colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed it.